Welcome to a series of videos about Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. In this introductory video, I'll say a few words about the origins of the poem, as well as its genre and form. Shelley wrote this ode in the fall of 1819. At the time, he was living in Florence, Italy. As Shelley explains in one of the notes he added to the poem, this poem was conceived and chiefly written in a wood that skirts the Arno near Florence, and on a day when that tempestuous wind, whose temperature is at once mild and animating, was collecting the vapors which pour down the autumnal rains. They began, as I foresaw, at sunset, with a violent tempest of hail and rain, attended by that magnificent thunder and lightning peculiar to the Cisalpine regions. Cisalpine means on the south side of the Alps, the mountain range to the north of Italy. Shelley clearly found the experience sublime and attempted to capture it in his poem. As the writer Edmund Burke had previously argued, one aspect of the sublime is terror, and in Shelley's case, the stormy west wind reminded him of his own mortality. As the critic James Beery has noted, Shelley wrote in his notebook that the falling leaves made him self-conscious about his graying hair. Shelley even wrote a little poem about this. It reads in part, "'Twas the 20th of October, and the woods had all grown sober, as a man does when his hair looks as theirs did, grey and spare, when the dead leaves disappear," and so on. It's possible that this impression has some bearing on stanza 3 of Ode to the West Wind, where the sapless foliage of the ocean suddenly grows grey with fear. In any case, Shelley wrote the ode in a relatively short amount of time, and the poem was later included in his Prometheus Unbound volume, published in 1820. As far as the genre of the poem goes, an ode is traditionally a song of praise, or worship, or patriotism. The most famous writer of odes was the classical poet Pindar. Odes normally have three parts: the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. These parts were sung by a chorus, and singers would move across the stage from side to side. In the strophe, the movement was from right to left, and in the antistrophe from left to right. In other words, the strophe and antistrophe were opposite movements, whereas the final epode provided a kind of synthesis or conclusion. In our poem, we see a somewhat similar movement. The first three stanzas of Ode to the West Wind are the strophe. Here we see the effect of the wind on the leaves, the clouds, and the water. Then, in stanza 4, the antistrophe, Shelley becomes much more personal, talking about his own struggles. Finally, in stanza 5, Shelley creates an epode in which the wind inspires him to spread his message across the world. In addition to the Pindaric ode, another important influence is the Bible. In the 18th century, the Anglican bishop Robert Lowth had published his Lectures on the Sacred Poetry of the Hebrews. In this important work, he for the first time established that Hebrew poetry was based on parallel sentence structure. Now, lectures 25 to 28 of his work deal with the Hebrew ode, and they describe how these Jewish writers achieved sublime effects. As the critic Angela Layton has observed, in Lecture 27, which discusses the Song of Moses in Exodus 15, which commemorated the passing through the Red Sea, Robert Lowth writes, "Here we behold the passion struggling for vent, laboring with a copiousness of thought and a poverty of expression, and on that very account the more expressly displayed." In other words, Moses keeps adding more and more praise, as if he cannot find the words to praise God. In Ode to the West Wind, Shelley also continually expresses the difficulty of describing the effects of the wind. He calls on the wind to help him. But, as Angela Layton points out, there is a difference. She writes, "However, when the religious origins of the sublime are replaced by an aesthetic origin," aesthetic refers to the study and appreciation of beauty, "this failure of verbal representation is no longer registered as evidence for the magnitude of the deity, but as evidence of a creativity which continually outdistances the text. While the sublime ode in Shelley's hands advertises the insufficiency of its rhetoric, in other words, it cannot fully capture the moment, it also contains the knowledge that there might be nothing else. Ultimately, it's the poet's own powers of expression that are most sublime. What we can say then is that from the classical ode, Shelley inherited the structure of the ode, and that from the Bible he learned more about sublime expression. At the same time, Shelley's poem is quite different from either a Pindaric ode or a Hebrew poem. It's not about a person, and although the wind has a divine aspect, Shelley rejected belief in the God of Judaism and Christianity. In addition, the form of Shelley's ode is rather unique. Its poetic lines are much shorter, it borrows from other genres, and it has an unusual rhyme scheme. If you look closely, you'll see that each of the 5 stanzas is a sonnet, with 14 lines and an elaborate rhyme scheme. You can therefore think of the ode as a mini-sonnet sequence. And yet the rhyme scheme has almost nothing to do with the sonnet. Shelley borrowed his rhyme scheme, which is called terza rima, from the Italian poet Dante. Interestingly, Florence, where Shelley wrote the ode, was Dante's hometown, which makes this choice all the more fitting. In terza rima, each middle line of 3 becomes the first and third rhyme of the next set of 3 lines. This pattern is then broken up at the end of the stanza by a rhyming couplet. Terza rima is an apt choice given that its interwoven pattern, with rhymes alternating, reflects the way Shelley weaves together different descriptions: fall and spring, the ocean and the clouds, the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. In fact, even some specific imagery is all about a kind of entangling. Think of the tangled boughs of stanza 2. It's therefore fair to say that the genres themselves are mixed together in creative ways. The critic Eric Powell beautifully captures how Shelley's formal choices bring together different historical periods. He writes, "What hasn't been recognized is that these forms correspond to the 4 major historical eras, as understood in Shelley's time: classical, the ode; medieval, terza rima; Renaissance, the sonnet; and contemporary. And perhaps we could even include the Old Testament period as well. But there's one final thing to add. The sublime is all about confusion and contrast. Just as Shelley is overwhelmed by the west wind, so he wants to overwhelm us with a complex mixture of genres and forms. He wants us to be awed by his poetic achievement."